Welcome to Norse Mythology, the unofficial guide. It's unofficial because I'm neither a credentialed academic nor a time-traveling medieval Norse pagan, but I deal with this material directly from the sources, interpreted through the lens of the experts and their opinions. If you're looking for depth and detail in a simple and accessible way, then you're in the right place.
Ve råda skal fyrda skär, ätilins ena dags, för att enu sidni skal olda skär, fara till helgar hedan. Power over his property every man shall have always until that one day, for on one day only shall every man depart from here to hell. This is stanza 10 from the poem Faulkes, which recounts in great deal the conversation Sigurður has with the dragon Fafnir immediately after stabbing him. Fafnir has just warned, or maybe cursed, Sigurður that the treasure he's about to take possession of, now having killed the dragon, will ultimately be the cause of his own death. Sigurður responds here with stanza 10, essentially saying, "Who cares? We all have a fated death day." But more specifically, he says, "On that one day shall every man depart from here to hell." And of course, here I need to throw in the obligatory, this is not a reference to the Christian hell, for anyone who may be skipping around the episodes. Deciphering the Norse hell is what this episode is all about. Anyway, keep in mind that our mythological sources were never designed to be a Norse Bible. We can't expect the authors of every poem to be meticulously considering the finer points of a shared and documented North Germanic religious canon and then choosing their words carefully in order to conform to some idea of proper doctrine. That's just not how it worked. But even so, it seems odd, at least on the surface, that the author of Faulkes wouldn't have been familiar with the idea of Valhall, and that he wouldn't have made some mention of heroes or kings going there. And in fact, the stories about Sigurður in particular are fascinating because they don't include Valhall at all. Earlier members of his family do go there in earlier parts of the saga, but as I've mentioned numerous times already, Sigurður himself is never attested as going to Valhall, and there are actually various attestations of his one-time lover Brynhildr following him into hell. In the poetry that informs some later bits of the saga, Sigurdur's widow Gudrun finds herself in Hunland, having a conversation with Herborg, who is queen of the Huns, and in that conversation, Herborg says this, quote, "I have a heavier harm to speak of. My 7 sons in the Southlands, my husband as the 8th, all fell in slaughter. I myself had to lay them out. I myself had to bury them. I myself had to handle their journey to hell. All that I endured in 1/2 year. Thus no man could ever give me any joy." End quote. This idea of people journeying to hell, even though they may have fallen in slaughter, is repeated again in the Greenlandic lay of Atli. Here's one quote in particular. "You are lying now, Atli, though I don't really care. I was hardly ever docile, but you lorded it greatly. You young brothers fought each other, sent strife round amongst yourselves, half your line were sent off to hell. Everything tottered which should have been to our advantage." End quote. All of this seems like a far cry from what Snorri gives us in the Prose Edda when he says, quote, "All those men that have fallen in battle since the beginning of the world have now come to Odin in Valhall." End quote. So what's going on here? As you have probably come to expect by now, the answer isn't super clear-cut. So let's dive into this idea of hell and what it means in the ancient Norse mindset. The word hell in our sources refers to 2 things. On the one hand, hell is a place where at least some of the dead go after departing this life. On the other hand, hell is a person who rules in that same realm of the afterlife. I say person because you may be surprised to learn that Hel the individual is never actually referred to as a goddess anywhere in our sources. She certainly does have some power and authority over very fundamental processes in the universe, but goddess just isn't a word that's ever recorded in connection with her. But the word hell itself is used quite a bit in the sources, most commonly as a location, though there are a good number of references to the person as well. Mostly, these references assume that the audience already has an understanding of these things, but we do get a bit of a backstory in the Prose Edda, so let's start there. In Gylfaginning 34, we're told about the origins of Loki's children, which culminates in the story of Fenrir biting off Tyr's hand and being bound on Lyngvi Island until Ragnarok. As the story goes, the Aesir discovered that Loki had fathered 3 children with the Jotun woman Angerbotha, and these children were Fenrir the monstrous wolf, Jormungandr the monster sea serpent, and Hel, interestingly not a monstrous animal, but an anthropomorphic female. Having learned by prophecy that these children were going to be the cause of total disaster and calamity, Odin ordered the children brought to him. Fenrir ended up getting bound until the end of the world, Jormungandr was cast into the ocean, and Hel was likewise, quote, cast into Niflheimr. The wording here clearly implies an exile-like state. She was quite literally thrown out. But in Hel's case, Odin, for whatever unstated reason, also decided to give her authority over 9 realms, such that it has become her job to administer board and lodging to those sent to her, and Snorri clarifies that those are the people who die of sickness and old age. I should note that Hilda Ellis Davidson is skeptical of Snorri's description here that Hel receives all those who die of sickness or old age. She suspects that this might be his own attempt at sussing out some kind of a cohesive system. Basically, he's already told us that all the slain warriors go to one place, so now he has to tell us that everyone else must therefore go to this other place. She notes that the one person who actually does go to Hel in Snorri's account is actually Balder, and Balder doesn't die of sickness or old age himself, but is actually killed by a weapon. Snorri goes on to tell us that Hel is easy to recognize when you see her, because not only is she downcast and rather fierce-looking, but she is also, quote, blåholv and holv med horndarlit, meaning literally half blue but half skin-colored. I may have mentioned before that blue here doesn't mean like a cartoony blue. It's the color Old Norse uses to refer to decayed corpses. This is backed up by lines like the one we find in Grettis saga, where the dead body of a fellow named Glamr is referred to as, quote, blår sem hell and digger sem naut, meaning blue as hell and bloated like a bull. Snorri also tells us that Hel has all sorts of things in her hall named with all sorts of negative symbolism. The hall itself is called Eljuthnir, which means rain damp, and inside she has a plate called hunger, a knife called starving, a threshold called stumbling block, a bed called sick bed, and bed hangings called pale misfortune. She has a serving boy named Ganglati, which means lazy walker, and a serving woman named Ganglolt, which means apparently the exact same thing, but for a girl. Rudolf Simek interprets these names as alluding to Hel being a place of punishment or maybe torment of some kind. And he takes issue with this description because, as he says, in Germanic mythology, Hel is not a place of punishment. According to Simek, we only start to get descriptions of Hel portrayed as some kind of a bad place in Snorri, Saxo, and some of the later Eddic lays, essentially as a product of the High Middle Ages, well after Christian ideas have firmly set in. That said, I would like to add to this that we don't get any descriptions at all of what Hel is like prior to Snorri, Saxo, and some of the later Eddic lays. I do agree that there's no reason to assume Hel was thought of as a place of punishment in pagan Germanic belief, at least generally, but we have been told it exists in Niflheimr, which is a misty, cold place. In the poem Baldur's Draumar, a dead seeress describes the weather in Hel when she says, quote, Var ek snivin snjovi, och slegen regni, och drivin dolgo. I was snowed upon, I was rained upon, dew fell upon me. We can also compare this to other Indo-European worlds of the dead, where we do sometimes get a repeat of this sort of bleak, sunless, neutral place. The Greek underworld, for instance, or at least part of it as it shows up in Homer's writings, is another such dark, shadowy, post-existence location. One similarity with Hel we find is that the Greek underworld is also named after the deity who rules it, who in this case is Hades. There are also rivers associated with Hades as there are with Hel, and it's described as being both underground and also way out on the periphery of the world at the outer limits of the ocean. In the Norse context, we get descriptions that point towards Hel being underground as well, and descriptions of it being way out in the northern periphery in Niflheimr. Whereas the gates of the Greek underworld are guarded by the three-headed dog Cerberus, Baldur's Draumar has Odin encountering a bloody-chested dog guarding the gates of hell. It's often assumed this is the same dog named Gormr, who shows up in some other references. In religions from India, which, believe it or not, are also Indo-European and are therefore anciently related to Norse paganism, we actually get something a little different. Here, the world of the dead is called Patala, which means something like below the feet. There are also 7 sort of sub-realms within Patala, one of which is also called Patala, and even though there's no sunlight there, the whole thing is described as a really beautiful place with forests and lakes, all decorated with light-emanating jewels. The Bhagavata Purana actually refers to these realms as subterranean heavens. On this idea of sub-realms within the world of the dead, I should mention that back in the Greek tradition, Hades also contains 2 sub-realms. And by sub, I don't mean they're stacked on top of each other, I just mean subdivisions of a larger domain. One is called Tartarus, which is, I guess, where the bad guys go, if we want to dramatically oversimplify things. And the other one is, in the earlier literature, a really exclusive club for heroes and for people related to the gods that's located out on the western periphery of the world in a place called Elysium. This is a paradise type of place full of fields and groves and flowers and water. It's sometimes called the Elysian Fields or Elysian Plains, and could theoretically bear some relation to the idea of the lush underworlds of the Indian tradition, and even to the Norse Folkvanger, since Vanger implies an afterlife field, and so does the Old English Neorksnoang, which also refers to a paradisiacal afterlife, even though we know almost nothing else about it. In places outside the breakdown in Gylfaginning 34, we can also find a few more details about Hell. For example, Hell's Hall is described as being high and surrounded by a wall with a gate that gets 3 different names throughout the sources. It's been called Helgrind, which means Hellgate, Nalgrind, which means Corpse Gate, and Valgrind, which I bet you can figure out if you think about it for a second. That's right, it means Slain Gate. It's the same Val that we find in Valkyria and the same Val that we find in Valhall. The poetry also makes mention of the road leading to Hell, which it aptly names the Helveg, or Hell Road. In order to get there, you also have to cross the river Gjol by way of a bridge called Gjallarbru, which Simek notes does seem to be related to native ideas, but also seems really close to the idea of the Bridge of Souls that we see showing up in Christian visionary literature from around this time. According to Snorri, this bridge is guarded by a woman named Moldgudr, whose job seems to be something like a passport agent that asks you what your business is before you embark further down the Hell Road. Throughout the sources, Hell is not clearly treated as a good entity or an evil entity. She is suspiciously absent from Ragnarok narratives, for example, although her name does pop up once in Snorri's version. In Gylfaginning 51, we're getting descriptions of all the different armies arriving on the scene of the final battle on the field of Vigridr, and in that context, we're told, quote, "By then, Loki will also have arrived there, and Hrym, and with him all the frost giants, but with Loki will be all Hell's people." Who exactly Hell's people are is hard to say. Does she have an army? Has she placed Loki in charge of it in lieu of leading it herself? Does Hell's people simply mean the dead? Are they some kind of Jotnar retinue from Niflheimr? Your guess is really as good as mine. In any case, she's certainly not entirely unreasonable when dealing with the gods. After Baldur dies, she's willing to strike a deal that would have allowed him to come back, although it turns out the Aesir end up not being able to fulfill the requirements. Which sort of leads into the next point. John Lindow notes that many texts speak of dying in terms of being held by Hell. One great example of this is from Saxo's Gesta Danorum, where we get a euhemerized account of Baldur's bad dreams and later death. The way Saxo tell it, the 2 brothers Baldur and Holdr from Norse mythology are characters named Balderus and Hutherus, and they're 2 guys with armies who are essentially at war with each other over a girl. And at this point in the story, Hutherus has already stabbed Balderus once, nearly to death, but Balderus is still clinging to life even though he realizes that his death is probably imminent. One night, he has a dream where Proserpine, who stands in for Hel here as a Roman goddess of death, appears at his bedside and tells him that in 3 days' time she will clasp him in her arms. And sure enough, 3 days later, his injury gets the better of him and he dies. Afterward, he receives a royal funeral and is buried in a mound. We'll come back to that idea in a little bit. Lindow also takes the position that Hel's authority over 9 realms is a reference to 9 underworld realms specifically. And as I was doing research for this episode, I realized that this idea is a bit more common and accepted than I initially thought. It comes up again in Lindow's chapter called Worlds of the Dead that he co-authored with Anders Andrén for Pre-Christian Religions of the North. Davidson also seems content to accept this notion in her book The Road to Hell. Traditionally, I've been a bit hesitant about this though, and here's why. As we discussed in episode 25, the phrase 9 realms only comes up 3 times in the sources. Hel being given authority over 9 realms to administer board and lodging to those who are sent to her is one of those 3. We could assume that this means she is lodging people in different locations throughout 9 underworld realms, or we could just as easily assume it means she has authority over people who die anywhere in the world, with the phrase 9 realms just being a reference to the sum total of everywhere. The second use of this phrase comes from the poem Völuspá, where a seeress mentions that she remembers 9 realms, but then doesn't say anything more about them. And the third is from Vafthrûdnismál, where the Jotun Vafthrûdnir explains that the reason he knows so many secrets about the gods and the Jotnar is because, according to Larrington's translation, he's traveled 9 realms and through into Niflhel, a place where men die down out of hell. But here's the catch I noticed on this go-round, and this is why it pays to do your own translations every once in a while. What Vafthrûdnir says specifically is, Hvern hefi ek heim kommet, niu kom ek heima fyr Niflhel neðan, hunnig dauye helju halir. And having now done my own literal translation of this stanza, I can tell you that what it says exactly is, quote, every realm have I come to, 9 realms I came to beneath Niflhel, there people die from out of hell, end quote. If we go by a literal interpretation of this phrasing, all of a sudden it starts to feel very much more like Norse mythology might have underworld realms, just as we find in some of these other Indo-European traditions. This also becomes the obvious source of Snorri's account of Hel being given authority over 9 realms, and sort of makes me think that perhaps this is how Snorri interpreted the 9 realms as well. 9 underworld realms. On the other hand, that second reference in Völuspá doesn't exactly seem like it points in this direction, and there are no references in any other poetry, sagas, or anything else wherein we get an idea that the underworld is divided up into various realms. There are also exactly 0 references to anybody actually being assigned to one of these various underworld realms, assuming that Hel is a unique place and they all exist inside of that place. Over countless references to people dying and going to Hel, they always just go to Hel, and then that's the end of the story. No character has ever been attested as going anywhere else from there. If we're looking for a reconciliation between these ideas, it might be smart to start wondering whether or not Hel itself might have been sometimes thought of as an overarching term for all places where the dead end up going. This may seem weird at first, but remember that ancient Norse religion wasn't exactly a constant, unified set of beliefs frozen in time. And this idea may start to fall a little better into place with this next bombshell revelation that you may not already be aware of. The one other thing Lindow mentions in his handbook is that older poetry tends to conceptualize people as being in Hel rather than with Hel, and he suggests that the older conception of the word probably did refer exclusively to a place, and that the female personification of this place came only later. Simek adds a bit more to this idea, asserting his belief that the first kennings referring to Hel the person are found at the end of the 10th and beginning of the 11th centuries, which is in the last century of the canonical Viking Age and a time when much of Scandinavia had already been converted to Christianity. According to Simek, phrases like coming to Hel are used in Eddic and Skaldic poetry simply as synonyms for dying. He even goes so far as to say that nothing speaks in favor of there being a belief in a goddess called Hel in pre-Christian times. Now, that's sort of a big claim, and Simek is sort of known for coming to big conclusions from limited data, and this one actually deserves a bit of a closer look. In Worlds of the Dead by Lindow and Andrén, we get a little more rigorous analysis of these terms in poetry. And they conclude that early poetry does indeed tend to treat Hel as a word for a world of the dead. However, it turns out that the idea of Hel being Fenrir's sister and the daughter of Loki does in fact go all the way back to the earliest skalds, particularly to a guy named Bragi Boddason, who is traditionally remembered as being the first skald and whose works date back to the first half of the 800s AD, which is firmly in the pagan period. Here's an example. Bragi wrote a famous poem called Ragnarsdrapa, which uses the following phrase poetically to refer to death. Ulfsat sinna med algivris livru, which means to accompany the sister of the complete monster of a wolf. He also used the phrase travel with Hel, which clearly implies a person and not a place. In the later 800s, we get Thjodolfr Orhwini's poem Ynglingatal, which contains the phrases Lokamar, which means daughter of Loki, and Bylest Bróðurmar, which means daughter of the brother of Bylestr, who again is Loki. The identity of Bylestr is clarified by Gylfaginning 34, which tells us that Loki is called the son of Noll and Forbauti, and the brother of Bylestr and Helblindi. If you weren't already aware that Loki had brothers, these are their names. And it's fun to note that one of these names, Helblindi, is a name Odin uses for himself in the poem Grimnismol. Getting back on track here, Lindow and Andrén conclude that there was clearly a conception of a female personification of death who was the daughter of Loki and sister of a wolf held among the earliest skalds. But weirdly, they never call her by name, and in fact, the word Hel doesn't even show up in the kenning system used by older poets. This doesn't mean it's wrong, of course, just that we don't have any record of it. One other poem, usually thought to have been composed in the 900s, actually uses both conceptions of Hel. This is the poem Sonatorek by Egil Skallagrimsson that I've mentioned once or twice on the show before. Here, Egil talks about Hel as a person standing on the headland where his son died, and also mentions sending 3 people Helgengnir, which means hell-going, and is a construction that strongly implies going toward a location. Lindow and Andrén suggest that these ideas of traveling with Hel and having Hel show up in the location of a person's death might indicate Hel in pagan times having the function of a psychopomp, or in other words, a character who shepherds people into the world of the dead, sort of like we see Odin doing when he carries Sinfjotli's body away on a ferry in Volsunga Saga. So let's talk about where this word Hel comes from in the first place. The Old Norse word Hel derives from Proto-Germanic haljo and seems to have already been a reference to the underworld at that point in time. What we don't have are any really early Scandinavian references or even non-Scandinavian Germanic references that would point us in the direction of Hel being thought of as a person yet in the Proto-Germanic era. Now, here's the thing. The noun haljo is apparently derived from a verb, which is helenon, and which means to hide or conceal. And so already we start to get a sense that the word chosen to represent the underworld is related to the idea of hiding or concealing something. In fact, another related word, hylja, still means conceal in Old Norse, and more specifically, all these words descend from the even earlier Proto-Indo-European root kel, which means to cover something. So it's nearly impossible to look at this and not see an obvious connection to the grave. To say that another way, there appears to be an early sense here that going to Hel may have once been synonymous with going to the grave, and is potentially still being used this way in poetry on into the Norse period, at least in some cases. To be sent to hell is to be sent to a covered place of concealment, the grave, where the dead physically go, and this helps inform the symbolism of finding yourself wrapped in hell's embrace, as a dead person becomes enveloped in the grave. I usually don't go this particular way of analysis because I think a lot of people go way too far with it, but some scholars have even brought up an idea of there being a kind of erotic component to having hell's arms wrapped around you and not letting go. And I'll say this about that, which is that the entering of the grave could speak towards this erotic possibility as well, but I'm not going to go any farther. In her book Road to Hell, Davidson notes that because so much of our source material exists in the form of poetry, there might be moments where we're encountering metaphor as opposed to something literal. Her opinion is that the idea of hell as queen of the underworld is mostly the invention of Snorri, who was, in her mind, sort of smashing elements from the Christian tradition together with poetic metaphor. In my opinion, hell is very likely not exclusively a person and not exclusively a metaphor, but is probably a bit of both. In a metaphorical sense, hell might be the grave, or more broadly, the resting place of the dead body. It's the place where, as Sigurður says, all men go upon death. And in this sense, it does not preclude the soul of the human from finding its way to Valhall, or Folkvanger, assuming those are even separate places, or even to a bleak, sunless, cold, and damp underworld. All of these locations could be thought of as extensions of hell, part of the underworld, the world underground, the patala below our feet, where we place our dead. The classic saga trope of people dying, being placed into burial mounds, and continuing to kinda live there seems likely to point in this direction as well. If you break into a mound to steal a sword, for example, you better be ready for the dead guy holding it to try and stop you, even though he may be thought of as being in hell or even in Valhall. In the second poem of Helgi Hundingsbani, after Helgi dies, his widow's maid sees him riding with a large company of men into his burial mound. She asks him if he's been allowed to come home from death, and he says that he hasn't. He does spend the night in the mound with his wife, though, and after that night, he doesn't come back to his mound again. It's a really weird episode, and the only reason we're given for Helgi being there is that he wants his wife to clean his wounds. But it suggests a really interesting connection between Valhall, literally the Hall of the Slain, and the burial mound, which is constructed also quite literally as a hall for the noble dead. It's where Baldur was placed in Saxo's story when he was finally clasped into Hell's embrace. On the other hand, Hel is Loki's daughter and sister of the wolf, already in the 800s. If we were to assume these ideas were intended to be metaphorical and that everybody understood them that way, it leaves us with a pretty big unanswered question as to why the grave intuitively makes sense as being conceptualized as Loki's daughter. Hel also at least ends up with a physical description. Even if this description is embellished by Snorri, the idea of being blue as hell shows up elsewhere and certainly refers to the site of death. Plus, this alleged metaphor ends up so anthropomorphized that she even has conversations and makes deals with other characters. At this point, why insist that hell is just a metaphor, but not apply the same logic to somebody like Thor, who is almost certainly just a personification of thunder? And on top of this, even if we can think about various afterlife locations as extensions of hell, it seems like this is not what was in the poet's mind when he wrote about Odin riding from Osgarður, where Valhall stands, downward into hell. The key, I think, really lies in this idea of information being early or late. What does it mean if we say that hell as a personified character only shows up in the belief system, quote, later? Later compared to what? Later than the Proto-Germanic period? Later than an earlier stage in the same period? Is an earlier stage of North Germanic pagan belief more valid or correct than a later stage of North Germanic pagan belief? Is migration era belief more valid or correct than Viking Age belief? It's important to remember that these things naturally change and evolve over time. Earlier isn't better, but it can often be more ambiguous if it means we don't have as much surviving information. There does seem to be a good argument for the idea that some of the details we get in the later material could have been inspired by the Christian tradition. And there certainly seems to be no reason to think of hell generically as a place of punishment in opposition to Valhalla. Although it wouldn't be that surprising if there was some sub-realm within hell where the worst people go, dying down out of hell into something like a Tartarus, maybe to get their corpses chewed on by the dragon Nidhogr for all of time or something like that. Unfortunately, there's a lot of ambiguity here. I can't tell you exactly when the idea of the grave first connected with the underworld, and I can't tell you exactly when the idea of the underworld became personified, any better than I can tell you exactly when that big booming noise we hear during rainstorms became personified. But I can tell you this. If you step too far out of line, that big booming noise is going to come smack you with his hammer and knock you straight into hell, which is the only place he's ever knocked anyone with that hammer. I can't think of too many reasons he might want to do this to a human, though, unless, of course, you decide to miss out on the next episode of Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide. Sources for this episode include Dictionary of Northern Mythology by Rudolf Simek, 2007. Gesta Danorum, translated by Karsten Friis-Jensen and Peter Fisher, 2015. Norse Mythology, A Guide to the Gods, Heroes, Rituals, and Beliefs by John Lindow, 2002. The Road to Hell by Hilda Roderick Ellis, later known as Hilda Ellis Davidson, 1968. Worlds of the Dead by John Lindow and Andrén in Pre-Christian Religions of the North, Volume 2, 2020. The Poetic Edda, translated by Carolyne Larrington, 2014, and the Prose Edda, translated by Anthony Faulkes, 1995.